But by 1917, the Germans had increased their attacks on unarmed ships. And then they brazenly urged Mexico to invade the United States. The president felt he had no other option.
Mr. Speaker!
On April the 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson stood anxiously before a special session of Congress and asked for a declaration of war. He hoped it would be the war to end all wars.
He said, "It is a fearful thing for me to try to lead a great peaceful people into war. It could be one of the most terrible and disastrous of all wars. But let me tell you this, right is more precious than peace."
The idea of a last great war and being part of it was very, very strong appeal. And it certainly influenced me a great deal. I said, if we're never going to see another war, this is the time to see it.
In the summer of 1917, American troops landed in France, returning the favor of Lafayette, the French soldier who had fought with America during the Revolutionary War.
One of the officers, he said it loud enough for everybody to hear it. "Lafayette," he was waving his hand. "Lafayette, Lafayette." I didn't know who Lafayette was. "Lafayette, Lafayette, we're here."
We was coming to the end of our men, and when the Americans decided to have a go, I was absolutely, I could have said hooray.
They were untouched by the anxiety and doubt that had afflicted everybody else by that stage. They were American, you know, they were what Americans were supposed to be.
They were enthusiastic. They were also badly armed, poorly trained, and like the Europeans before them, completely unprepared for what lay ahead of them.
The train came through from the front, and we got to go aboard, of course, which we did as soon as we could get on it, and ask the guys how it was up there, what's going on, and what do you do? And it was a hospital train. I can see these poor kids, like me, youngsters, with a leg gone, or two arms gone.
Well, this was a kind of a cold water treatment all of a sudden to realize what war was like. You grew up very quickly in surroundings like that. It was no longer freshman studies. It was the real world.
By 1918, with thousands of Americans pouring into France every day, the Germans decided they had to do something massive.
In March 1918, the German army tried its last major gamble, last major offensive on the Western Front, and it was successful. It was a remarkable moment. The Western Front moved. The war of movement finally arrived.
And after years of impasse, the Germans suddenly threatened to overwhelm the Allies and actually capture the French capital, Paris.
The Germans had a fire. They called it sweeping fire. Everything up on earth got hit. They either was wounded or died.
The threat to Paris was so severe that 1 million people simply left the city. The Germans got to within 30 miles. At this point, these still semi-trained American divisions were thrown into the battle, and along with the French, managed to stop the German drive.
The Germans had put everything into this last desperate effort, and when it was over, they were finally spent. Along the Western Front that autumn, the focus shifted from war to peace. On the 10th of November, the Kaiser was forced into exile by his own government, a victim of the war he had helped to start.
This struck me so deeply that I can tell you I had a little picture of the Kaiser in my room. What did I do? I put a black tie around the picture to show my utter sorrow for this tremendous change in history.
And finally, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, November 1918, the Germans formally surrendered.
And suddenly, the guns stopped, and it was a terrible shock. It was as if somebody had hit me over the head with a big pan.
That sudden hush, after 4 years of continual gunfire, had become part of our life. There seemed to be something missing. We didn't believe it, you know.
One of the greatest calamities in human history was over, and America's veterans began to return home. The trouble was that having made the world a safer place, American veterans returned to a very uncertain future. The economy that had boomed during the war was now shrinking. Factories were laying off workers, just as veterans came looking for jobs.
We had no help to find a job, no grants to go to school and finish our college education. When you took your discharge, that was it. You had no more connection with the government or they with you. You were on your own.
In the winter of 1918, Europe was a disaster. The empires of Germany, Austria, and Russia had been shattered, leaving destitute nations in their wake. Even the victors, Britain and France, grappled with ruin and rage. In all, 9 million men had died. Every family had lost someone: a father, a son, a brother, a cousin, a friend. For years, the wounded and the maimed haunted the streets of every city in Europe. And even those who had escaped physical harm were forever changed by the Great War.
Sometimes I'm thinking about the war 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. My brother being hit, my best friend being killed. I wonder while I'm lying in bed, how is it that I'm lying here and they're all dead? Well, I lost all my youth. I lost the best years of my life, you might say, and I lost so many friends. It was all lost for me. I mean, a few medals don't make up for that, you know. Nobody wins in a war. They lost. We didn't win.
Into this chaos, traveling to a post-war peace conference in the French town of Versailles, came President Woodrow Wilson. With him, President Wilson brought his so-called 14 points, which called for liberty and self-determination for all, even the enemy. The people of Britain and France greeted Wilson ecstatically, for he represented the hope of democracy. But the British and French governments were interested in revenge.
The Versailles Peace Treaty is the politics of hatred. It was the encapsulation of every mean-spirited element on the Allied side.
The new Soviet Union was completely excluded from the peace conference, and not one victorious power was ready to give up a colony. Sowing the seeds of future discord, Britain and France added several colonies by carving up the Middle East. As for the Germans, they were forced to accept conditions that would humiliate and impoverish them for years. In the end, Versailles was about punishment, not peacemaking.
In many ways, all those men who died, 9 million men, died for nothing.
Almost before it was over then, it was clear that the legacy of this war would be anything but the end of all wars. Within 30 years, these same nations would all fight again over precisely the same ground. The war had shown technology's dark side. But dark or bright, technology was here to stay. And in the decade that followed, an electric pulse of change ran through America. We'll see that on the next episode of The Century, America's Time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Jennings.